You yawn, lifting a hand off of the steering wheel to cover your mouth. It's been another long week, but you weren't too terribly far from home now. Your eyes glaze over as you watch the rain beat down on the windshield. You look forward to taking a shower, reheating some leftovers, and putting on a quick episode or two before bed. You round the bend of the road and slam on the brakes. It's a girl in a long, pale blue dress, walking at the edge of the road in the rain. You stare at her as your heart thunders in your ears. She waits. You aren't really in the habit of picking up hitchhikers, but this girl, she just looks so miserable. She doesn't even have a purse with her, let alone a hidden weapon. And with no phone, she's out here in the middle of the night with no way to call for help. Weighing your choices, your compassion wins out against your general rule of thumb. You roll down the window and ask, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She climbs into the backseat of your car, shivering. You reach across to your passenger seat, grabbing the coat that you'd tossed there. You hand it back to her. "Here, use this." She glances down at the coat, then back up at your face. Noticing her hesitation, you smile. "Don't worry, the coat can dry later. Let's get you warm." She offers a small smile of thanks, accepting the coat. You turn back to the front and crank up the heat. Your foot eases off of the brakes, and away you go. You glance up at the rearview mirror. Where are you headed? A long pause. 3578 Lilac Drive. You only barely catch the address. It's hardly louder than a whisper. But you nod your head. All right. You plug the address into your phone. That's only a few streets down from me. The drive passes in silence, and you assume she must be nervous. When you catch her eye in the rearview mirror, you smile reassuringly at her, but she quickly turns back to the window. She just looks so sad. You pull up in front of a small house that's seen better days. It's clearly well cared for, but the grass is slightly too long, the walls dingy with dirt. All of the curtains are closed, and there seems to be no obvious sign of life. You start to turn towards the girl, still looking at the house. "Are you sure this is the right place?" No answer. You turn around. She's gone. You whip around from left to right, looking to see if she's walking around the car, but nothing. The door never opened. She never said a word. And your coat sits on the seat, crumpled in a crescent moon, as if she'd just thrown it off her shoulders. This is too weird for such an exhausting day, but you can't bring yourself to leave. Not yet. You walk up the steps to the faded door, knocking a few times. The door opens, but stops abruptly when it meets the end of the chain. An older woman with hollow eyes peers through the crack. She looks nervous, but unsurprised. "Oh, sorry to disturb you, ma'am, but I picked up a girl who had me drive her here. Did she make it inside?" The old woman's eyes drift slowly down, her gaze focusing on a far distant place. It's clear she's not seeing you, but a person and time long gone. You jump as the door closes, but you hear the chain being pulled away. The door opens wide this time, the old woman still not quite looking at you. She wordlessly gestures towards the wall beside her. Peering around the corner, you see a framed newspaper, the headline reading, "Tragic accident at Locust Bend, kills one." Under the headline is a photo of... Was she your granddaughter? The woman now stares with an intense focus at another frame, this one removed from tragedy. The girl in the photo smiles brightly, eyes fixed on the person behind the camera. The old woman finally blinks, her face falling. Tired. So tired. Her loved one so close, yet so far. My daughter. She's been trying to get back to us ever since. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. A girl doomed to repeat the same path, doing just about anything to get back to her family. A family repeatedly traumatized by the kind bystanders that try to return their loved one. But who is she? How has she remained the same and yet changed? How has the story survived all this time? Does she look different in other places? This is the urban legend that has the most information by far. Hundreds of reports, half a dozen narrative variants, and literally centuries of history. I don't exactly have a week to describe every single version, but I've selected the most significant examples and analyses that I could track down. This is going to take 2 episodes, so our format is going to be a little different than usual. This first episode will go over the variations of the story, different endings, shuffling characters, and a mixture of ghostly behavior. The second episode will be the analysis of these stories as a whole, trying to figure out where this story came from, all of the countries at play in its history, why it survived, and how it's shifted. So buckle up to learn about one of the world's oldest ghosts. First off, there are so many stories of the vanishing hitchhiker that we have to separate them into categories. The most common way to classify them is by modeling the categories after Gillian Bennett's system of 4 categories. However, author Gail DeVos separates the stories into 6 subtypes. After much pacing back and forth, moving scraps of legends here and there, I realized that for the purposes of this show, I'd have to recategorize them yet again. The first type is all about seeking family. So the destination that the ghost is trying to get to is always where a family member lives. This first story came from a businessman who told the story of his friend, Sam Kearns. Kearns and a friend drive through a cold, rainy night after a party in San Francisco. Pulling up to a stop sign at Mission Street, they notice a woman dressed in a thin, white evening gown standing on the corner. They reason that she can't be waiting for the streetcar. It's 2 a.m. She accepts their offer to drive her home and climbs into the backseat of the 2-door sedan. They hand her a car blanket as she recites an address near Twin Peaks, explaining that she lives there with her mother. Though they try to start a conversation with her, she only responds briefly yet politely. When they reach 5th Street, Kearns' friend turns to make sure she's not too cold, but she's gone. He leans further over the seat to make sure she hasn't fallen to the floor. But the only thing left is the crumpled blanket. They even stop the car to get out and check, but she's nowhere to be found. Maybe she somehow slipped from the car, but they hadn't stopped until his friend checked the back seat at 5th Street. More confused than frightened, they decide to go to the address she'd given. They pull up to an old building with a dim light inside. A minute or 2 after knocking, a frail old woman draped in a shawl answers. The old woman smiles wanly at their story. "That's my daughter. She was killed in an automobile accident at First and Mission 2 years ago." A few almost identical versions were told in 1933 in Chicago, Illinois, around the time of the Century of Progress exhibition that was taking place at the World's Fair. The story has been incredibly popular in the Chicago area, told so frequently that the story even spawns its own special Chicago variant that we'll talk about in a little bit. A man drives alone in San Francisco on a wet, stormy day. Passing St. Ignatius' Church, a woman in a black dress and veil stands by the building. He offers her a ride, which she accepts. This time, she engages in lively conversation with him as they approach her address. Eventually, he realizes she's stopped responding to him, so he looks in the back seat. She's gone. Arriving at the home, a man answers the door and identifies himself as the girl's father. She died a year before. This is one of the most common versions, also being told in Hot Springs, Virginia in 1930, South Carolina in 1935, and others. One version even specifies that the driver had been the 7th kind citizen to try to bring her home. There are a handful of stories where the hitchhiker is actually a man as well. The story still follows the same beats, with the family identifying the hitchhiker as their son. This version from Philadelphia in 1937 or 38 starts with a hilarious note. Quote, "It seems that a friend of a friend whom none of us have ever actually met." Anyway, This friend had just dropped his girlfriend off after a dance, and he was headed for home. Through the rain and the mist, he spies a girl in a white satin evening dress, standing outside of a cemetery. You know the drill. They drive towards her home, but when they arrive, no girl in the back seat. The mother of the girl answers his knocks and identifies this spirit as her daughter, who'd been killed in an automobile accident at the spot he'd found her. She'd also died wearing the exact outfit that the boy describes to the mother. A version of this from Cleveland, Ohio, has the man pick her up at an intersection, later identified as the location of her death. The poor father who opens the door says he gets motorist visitors, and therefore a reminder of his daughter's death, every month. But I'll also give credit to the driver's awareness because he has the presence of mind to look around for an ambush before he lets her into the car. In 1939, a couple finds a young girl walking on a lonely road that runs around a lake near Fort Worth, Texas, in the middle of the night. She hops into the back seat, saying she'd gotten lost while on a picnic. She'd started to walk home when the rain began to fall. Once the couple reaches the address, they realize that the girl had disappeared. The old woman who answers the door tearfully tells them that the passenger was her daughter, who drowned while on a picnic 3 years ago, on that very night. This was the third time in 3 years that someone had come to her door, trying to bring her daughter home. This driver is out during an October dawn. Heading from Greenville to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he decides to take an old road to Greensboro. He's admittedly drowsy, until he startles awake as he speeds up to a young girl in a long gown, standing in the highway. He screeches to a halt, takes a few deep breaths, and asks if she needs any help. She explains that she'd gotten into a fight with her piece of shit boyfriend. He didn't like that she didn't want to perform a sex act on him while he drove. So he did what any reasonable boyfriend would do. He forced her out of the car, stranding her in the middle of the road. Without many other options, she accepts our driver's offer. He drives to the address, she disappears, you get it. But when an elderly woman opens the door, she looks at him and huffs. Not again. She explains to the confused young man that Mary had been killed in a car wreck 8 years ago, this narrator being the 5th person to have knocked on her door. This next story subtype includes tunnels. A driver is on the interstate from Greensboro to Lexington. He slows down as he approaches the Jamestown underpass that goes under train tracks. The spot is notorious for wrecks, as fog collects at the curve leading to the tunnel. When he's halfway through, a woman in a long white evening dress appears out of the fog at the end of the tunnel, waving in distress. She directs him to her home at High Point, explaining that, quote, "I was at a dance. My date and I had a quarrel. It was very bad. I made him drop me back there." Skip to when a white-haired woman in a night robe answers his knocks. When he tells her where he found the girl, she confirms that the spirit was her daughter. She'd been killed in a wreck at the tunnel 5 years ago. This routine had continued annually ever since. The sequence of events in this next story is a bit out of order. Instead of learning the truth at the end as a reveal, we're brought into the story with the information that a man's wife had been fighting an illness in a DC hospital, but she eventually passes away. Every year, the ghost of a woman flags down a taxi and instructs him to take her home. When the taxi driver inevitably knocks on the door, the husband, now widower, answers. The heartbroken man doesn't say a word. He just pays the driver. A version from Berkeley, California became incredibly popular. So popular that we can even take a look at how the story evolved with different forms of media. In the earliest telling, a young man picks up a girl at College Avenue and Bancroft Way. She directs him to an address on Durant Avenue, but she disappears in transit. When he asks who she was, she's identified as the deceased daughter of a University of California professor. The second telling goes as follows. A girl flags down a car at the corner of Bancroft Way and College Avenue on a rainy evening. In the car was 2 students, a couple. When she disappears, the couple rings the given building's doorbell. They learn that she'd been the professor's daughter, killed in an accident on the corner of Bancroft and College a few years ago. She annually appears to get a ride home. And here's the version broadcast on the radio. Quote, "If you live in Berkeley, perhaps the thing happened right there. A little girl was standing by a traffic light on the corner of Telegraph Avenue and Bancroft Way. She seemed hesitant to venture into traffic, and finally a motorist picked her up and took her to the home of a well-known doctor, who, she said, was her father. Of course, the girl disappeared on the way, and the doctor told the motorist that his daughter had been killed a month before in a traffic accident at Telegraph and Bancroft." Richard Beardsley and Rosalie Hankey wrote the 1942 paper The Vanishing Hitchhiker, and they tried to track down details about this specific story. They carefully sorted through city records, but couldn't find any evidence of a serious accident on that street corner, not in the 5 years before or the 5 years after the story's date. But even back in 1942, Beardsley and Hankey noted that this was one of over 60 locations that all insisted that they were the true location of the vanishing hitchhiker. This next version from DuQuoin, Illinois is quite unusual. As a side note, the story was told to the present narrator by a cousin who knew one of the two boys involved. A real friend of a friend story. Two boys are driving a bus through several towns in the evening. A downpour starts, cold waves of rain pummeling the metal roof. They'd been driving since morning, talking to stay awake. Suddenly, the sight of a girl in a white gown flashes through the rain, standing 100 feet in front of them by the side of the road. When they offer her a ride, she boards the bus and sits on the floor in the aisle, between the seats. She declines their offer to take a seat on an actual bench, and she also refuses a raincoat they try to pass her. She warms up during the drive, becoming more talkative as they press on. They're chatting away as the address approaches, but the already heavy downpour turns into a deluge. The boys grow quiet as they concentrate on the road, squinting through the glass. As they drive over a bridge, they ask her a question. When she doesn't answer, the boy not driving turns around. But she's not there. The bus hadn't stopped, a door hadn't opened. They drive for another half hour until they get to the station. Hopping off, they track down the address that the girl had given them. The woman who opens the door thanks them for coming, telling them that her daughter had been killed in a car accident 4 years ago, where they found her. We've reached a subcategory of this general story type, where the spirit leaves physical clues behind. Our first road is very long, very flat, and very, very boring. So boring that a good number of people had met their end by drifting off as they drove, crossing the highway, and slamming into an oncoming car. Traveling salesman Charles Best is driving down this stretch of road when he swerves to avoid a young woman in a party dress walking along the highway. He stops, throws the car into reverse, and rolls down the window to offer her a ride to the nearest gas station. Noticing a pile of orders, a briefcase, samples, and an old lunch on his passenger seat, he sheepishly suggests that she take the back seat. He shrugs off his coat and hands it back to her. She directs him to 1616 Oak Street. This address isn't horribly out of his way, so off they go. They cheerfully chat for the next 10 miles, but Best has a hard time finding the right street as he isn't really familiar with the area. When he asks her for more instructions, he's met with silence. He even pulls over to look around, but he can't find her. It's already proven to be a very late, very weird night, so he decides to sleep in the car until morning so he could report this incident to someone. The next morning, he makes some inquiries at the local coffee shop to find this Oak Street, and one of the waitresses draws a rough map on a napkin. Her directions prove accurate, and, soon enough, he's walking up the porch steps. An old woman answers the door, and she looks familiar. He starts to explain the night's events, but the woman bursts into tears and runs back into the home, so distraught that she leaves the door swinging open. Bewildered, Best stands in stunned silence until an elderly man hustles out onto the porch. This is all very hard on my wife, especially with people showing up out of the blue lately. I'm sorry? She says you tried to bring our girl home last night. Yes, I did. I know. Look, why don't you come with me? There's something you should probably see. Best, with dubious judgment, follows this man to his pickup truck and they both hop in. Even more unsettling, the man refuses to speak to Best until they pull up at the cemetery. There's nothing Best can do but to follow the man out of the car and into the cemetery. Reaching a grave, the man finally speaks. This is my daughter's. Best stares at the dates on the grave, reading that she died on the previous evening, but over a year ago. And what's that, crumpled next to the grave? Why, it's his coat, of course. On a Sunday afternoon in 1934, a group of friends drives through the rain towards Long Beach. They notice a girl in a white evening gown, a coat around her shoulders, waiting at an intersection at Atlantic Boulevard. Offering her a ride, she climbs into the back seat and recites an address in Long Beach. Try as they might, they can't get anything else out of her. She seems quite sad. She's, of course, gone when they reach the address. The old woman who answers the door smiles and says, "Yes, that was my daughter, who was killed in an automobile accident at the intersection the night of the Long Beach earthquake. Many others before you have picked her up to bring her home, always with the same results." At first, I wasn't sure if this cause of death was via the earthquake, especially if the earthquake caused the car accident, but I'm pretty sure that the Long Beach earthquake is mentioned as a way of grounding the story with a historical event. A married couple are driving home from a party in 1940 on a dark, deserted road. It isn't deserted for long. A girl holding a suitcase and coat stands by the side of the road. The couple are reasonably concerned about her safety, so they offer her a ride, which she silently accepts. They ride in an uncomfortable silence for half an hour. I don't know why it took a half hour, but this was the moment that the man turns to ask for the address. Only her coat and suitcase remain. The man is incredibly confused. They'd been driving at 35 miles per hour. She couldn't have jumped out without them noticing. They find an address on the suitcase. The 60-year-old woman who answers the door tells them that they were the 10th group to have brought her deceased daughter's suitcase and coat. This ghost story is quite unique, as the old woman opens the door next to her, showing them 9 identical suitcases and coats piled inside. The only information we get about the daughter is that she died when she was 16. Another unique component of this story is what happens to the couple. While we've seen most people walk away from their paranormal experience with nothing more than a chill down their spine and maybe a touch of existential dread, this couple isn't so lucky. The wife was already an anxious person, so she's committed to an asylum soon after. The story tactlessly reads of the husband, he nearly went wacky himself. Remember those 3 iterations of the Berkeley story, including the radio broadcast? Well, there's one more iteration of it, but it's so different that I've put it in the abandoned items subsection. You'll see what I mean. A friend of the narrator's drives up Hearst Avenue through the rain. At Northgate intersection, a female student carrying books under her arm is waiting for the streetcar. As he knows that the streetcar has stopped running for the night, he offers her a ride. They approach an intersection down Euclid, chatting. A car suddenly comes barreling down the steep hill, on a direct collision course. Tragedy is seconds away, when the girl pulls the emergency brake. Jerking to a stop, the other car zooms harmlessly past. The driver sits, stunned, as the other car continues on, like it hadn't almost killed someone. He turns to look at his passenger, but she's gone. Maybe she hopped out to walk the rest of the way, but her book sits innocently on the seat. He's too shaken to continue and goes home. The next day, he returns the book to the address she'd given him. An English professor opens the door and informs the boy that his daughter had been killed in an auto accident at the same corner 1 to 2 years ago to the day. The father accepts the book, confused, which makes me think that this might have been the spirit's first attempt to reach home. He walks into the library. This book was still on the shelf. He knew the exact spot. But when he lifts his hand to the shelf, the book's missing, now in his hand. Somehow, the physical book had gotten from their home library into the hands of a ghost. Now we get to our first story from Hawaii, taking place in 1926. The story is told to the narrator by a friend from Hawaii. The daughter of the governor of Hawaii was riding her bike when she was struck and killed by the, quote, first auto in Hawaii. This seems to be something traceable, so I tried to find out if this claim was true. Here's the thing. The first auto arrived on Hawaii on October 8, 1899. The first governor of Hawaii was Sanford B. Dole from 1900 to 1903, and he had no daughters. However, Hawaiian Governor George R. Carter had 4 children, 2 daughters, and 1 daughter died in 1903. I found the record of deaths from 1903 for Margaret Victoria Puolelani Lane Carter, but she was 34 years old when she died and wasn't the governor's daughter. I finally managed to find the death record for his daughter, but she seems to have died in childbirth, or soon after birth. And according to the article The Way We Rolled by the Honolulu Magazine, the first death via auto was in 1906, when, quote, a driver reversed over a 20-foot embankment and was crushed by his own car. As embarrassing as that is, it means that, at least according to official records, the first auto death wasn't a girl on a bike. All of this meaning that the identity of the ghost is up for debate. As a totally hilarious sidebar, the first auto theft on Hawaii was on the 4th of July in 1900. Fireman Pat Corcoran spied Lewis Grant's electronic horseless carriage, parked on Beretania Street. He hopped in and tried to start it. Considering that maybe a handful of people on the island would know anything about the vehicle, he didn't have much luck. So, he tried to get out and push the auto down the street. As the wheels rolled, he quickly hopped in and grabbed whatever controls he could get his hands on and yanked them in random directions. When this didn't work, he, quote, contented himself by ringing its bell, until a policeman caught up to him. Hilarious sidebar over. For the next 15 years after the accident, a number of people had picked up a girl pushing a smashed bike along the road. She hops into the back seat, giving the governor's mansion as her address. You know the rest. We finally reached our second story type, where, instead of being taken to a family home, she instead gives the address for a cemetery. The first batch of stories of this category are exactly what we've already heard before. The only difference is that the girl was picked up or dropped off at a cemetery. So I'm not going to bore you with almost identical retellings. However, the most significant part of this category, and arguably the most famous iteration of the Vanishing Hitchhiker, and possibly the oldest ghost in Chicago, is Resurrection Mary. The basic story is that 16-year-old Mary loved dancing at the O. Henry Ballroom, now known as the Willowbrook Ballroom. But of course, happiness in a ghost's origin story is temporary. She's killed in a hit and run on her way to or from the dance. The girl who loved to spin on the dance floor was buried in the dancing gown and shoes she loved so dearly. And so, this poor girl's ghost has been seen hitchhiking from the Willowbrook Ballroom to Resurrection Cemetery, or vice versa, since the 1930s. However, she doesn't have just one story. A version from 1934 claims that, on a winter night, she and her boyfriend had a fight. Mary stormed from the club, walking home. As she was passing Resurrection Cemetery, a car struck and killed her, fleeing the scene. In a twist of fate, Mary would, naturally, be buried at the same cemetery she died in front of. This ghost, while frequently described as being quiet and cold to the touch, seems to be almost violently desperate. She can cause near crashes by darting across the road in front of a driver. In the book, The Field Guide to North American Haunting, she sometimes even leaps into the car, passing right through the closed passenger door. But if she's taken home from the dance, she almost always gives Resurrection Cemetery as her destination. When she climbs out, the driver watches her pass through the iron bars. Quite a dramatic image, and ghost. She became a kind of supernatural staple for the Chicago area, and plenty of people seem to have a story about her. This ramped up in the 1970s, when Resurrection Cemetery underwent renovations, which seemed to disturb the ghostly teen. She made an appearance at a nightclub called Harlow's twice in 1973, dancing alone in a faded dress that various sources describe as a kind of wedding dress. But no one saw her enter, and no one saw her leave. I've tried to find this testimony, but I can only find the same sentence that's obviously been copy and pasted from site to site. On August 12, 1976, the Cook County Police responded to a call about a hit and run near the intersection of 76th Street and Roberts Road. A shaken young woman was at the scene. When they asked her what happened, she shakily pointed to a patch of wet grass. The police could see an obvious depression in the grass, about the size of a person. The frightened witness jerkily said that she'd found an unconscious or dead woman on the side of the road, in that very spot on the grass. But in the time it took for the cops to get there, she'd watched the body vanish. The year after this, a man reported to the police that he'd seen a frightened girl desperately clutching at the bars of Resurrection Cemetery. When he and the police went back to investigate, they didn't find the girl, but the iron bars had been bent and twisted. Small handprints melted into them. According to the legend, the bars have been replaced and repainted multiple times, but they always return to their crooked shape. In May 1978, a young girl darted in front of a couple driving down Archer Avenue. The driver swerved, but he knew it was too late. They were going to hit her. But the car passed right through the girl. Twisting to look behind them, they watched the girl walk through the bars of the cemetery. Report after report continued to stream in, dozens of motorists who saw Mary clutching the bars of the cemetery or nearly causing accidents. In the summer of 1996, the owner of Chet Melody Lounge, Chet Brzezinski, was leaving the bar at 4 a.m. when a man sprinted inside to use the phone. When he connected to the police, he explained he'd run over a girl on Archer Avenue, but he couldn't find the body. Chet was skeptical, until a truck driver also confirmed his story. Predictably, the police couldn't find her. But who is Mary? One interpretation says that Mary's true identity is that of Mary Bregovi, quote, a young Polish girl with striking blue eyes and beautiful blonde hair. This is based on truth, as I found the records, though the Chicago Tribune, who reported the incident, incorrectly named her Marie. Mary Bregovi was a factory worker and the child of Czechoslovakian immigrants, so she wasn't Polish. She was also a brunette, not blonde. She was indeed killed in 1934, on March 10th at the age of 21, and she did die of a car accident. She was buried in her favorite orchid-colored dress, eventually joined by her parents, Stefan and Joanna. Within the year, there were supposedly sightings of a girl in a purple dress. Another name that comes up frequently is that of Anna Marija Norkis, who seems to fit the young blonde Polish girl description. Ona was the daughter of Polish immigrants, who was brutally killed in July 21, 1927, when the car she was riding in went off the road. The car flipped over in a ditch on Harlem Avenue. 12-year-old Ona was crushed under the car. Her father, August Norkis, testified that the car was going 11 miles per hour when the crash happened. Now, this seems quite slow to us, but he details that the speed wasn't what flipped the vehicle. The car dropped over the lip of a sunken road, causing it to overturn. While Ona's description is a lot closer to the spirit in the legend, and she was interred at the Resurrection Catholic Cemetery and Mausoleums, she was only 12 years old, which tends to look fairly different from a 16 to 22-year-old that witnesses describe. I was kind of relieved to read that the cemetery won't share the location of her grave, which I definitely think is appropriate. Let this child rest in peace. However, there are dozens of Marys buried at Resurrection Cemetery who are aged 15 to 25. The two I've already described are the girls that most people connect Resurrection Mary to. But I think I could go through each Mary in the cemetery of appropriate age, and I bet we'd find details about them that fit the legend. There's just no way to know. While these next stories may or may not end at a cemetery, the story beat we're following now is that the driver either takes the hitchhiker to, meets her at, or takes her home from a dance. She turns far more social in these versions, being encountered at dance halls, nightclubs, and even beer joints. So let's go to our first story. Two young men are going to a dance in Tompkinsville, Kentucky. They pick up a girl hitchhiking on the side of the road, and she thinks that going to a dance is a great idea. The three of them dance together all night, until the dance hall closes. She asks them to drop her off at a small house on Meshack Road. So they drop her off, and, as it's now raining, the boys insist that she takes one of their coats. They swing by the next day to pick up the coat. The woman who answers the door tells them that the girl was her daughter, killed on the road they found her on. The boys find the coat, draped over the daughter's grave. The same story takes place in LA in 1940. After picking the girl up, she asks them to stop a minute as they're passing Evergreen Cemetery. She steps out of the car and walks in. After waiting a while, the boys grow frustrated. She stole the overcoat. They go in to investigate and find the overcoat draped over the girl's headstone. This same story from North Riverside, Illinois in 1939 has an extra detail. The boys notice that while they dance with the girl, her hand feels cold to the touch. The cemetery drop-off takes place this time at Oak Ridge Cemetery. When they reach the cemetery, she very creepily says, "I forgot. I promised I'd get out here." When they go to the house, the mother shows them pictures of her daughter, who died 2 years ago. She was even wearing the same dress. Tragically, this event plagues the boys so badly that one ends up in the Elgin Hospital for the Insane, dying 6 months later. Sometimes the mother directs the boys to the family cemetery specifically to find the grave of her daughter. Very occasionally, the mother and father answer the door and tell the daughter's story. In Salt Lake City, 1939, a young man meets a beautiful young girl in a white dress at a Christmas dance. They hit it off, talking and dancing all night. Trying to make a good impression, he offers to take her home, handing her his overcoat as they leave. They share the car with another couple, intending to drop everyone off. As they approach the mystery girl's address, she has them stop at the cemetery. She eerily asks to get out alone, but that she won't be very long. Of course, she never comes back. Concerned, they all get out to try to find her, but they find nothing. The next day, the young man goes to the address she'd given them, same exact ending as the last story. The meeting at a dance story feels romantic in general, sure. What with meeting a mysterious, alluring stranger at a dance before discovering that your love can never be. The era of a doomed romance is undeniable, but this story shifts to romantic overtones. The story was collected in the 1980s from a student in Senegal, West Africa, which should give you a prelude to how widely this story is known. A young taxi driver meets a woman at a dance, and it's love at first sight. He walks her home after the dance, lending her his sweater. When they reach her home, she turns to him. She smiles sadly. "I can't see you again." And with that, she walks into the house. The next day, the emotional young man returns, knocking on the door. An elderly woman answers and, hearing his story, tearfully tells him that he'd met her deceased daughter. but the young man becomes upset, refusing to accept such a story. Finally, the old woman takes him to her daughter's grave, where his own sweater is draped over the tombstone. Heartbreak and a newly discovered afterlife proves to be too much for him to take, and the young man goes insane. In 1940, in California, a musician and two of his friends go to a dance. As they mill about, they spot a girl who was so light she seemed to float on air. Bill, one of the boys, plucks up the courage to introduce himself. This goes better than expected, and she accepts his invitation to dance. Noticing that she felt cold to the touch, he passes her his coat as they leave. The story, at least this telling of it that I could find, interestingly skips the disappearing part of the story. This leads you as the reader to assume that he dropped her at home, as the last thing we hear is that she forgot to return the coat when she left. But Bill didn't mind. He was hoping that this excuse to return to the house would prompt another opportunity to get to know her. But, of course, the girl's mother answers the door, morosely informing him that she died 3 years ago. She even offers to accompany him to her daughter's grave. Sure enough, the coat is on the tombstone. But here's the more emotional note. Bill and the mother return to the home, where he meets the dead girl's sister. She seems to recognize him. She says, "Linda and I always waved to you on our way to school and went to every dance we could. Linda loved you, but of course you didn't know." The shock of accidentally ignoring her love until it was beyond too late was too much for Bill. Bill dies 2 months later. Even his two friends went insane, the narrator of the story just barely clinging to sanity. However, the narrator concludes the story by mentioning that he hadn't seen the girl's reflection in a mirror. Because, after all, quote, "you can't see a ghost in a mirror." This is one of the only stories I've come across where the driver knows the girl. This is obviously because most people would hear about the death of someone they know, which would ruin the story's twist ending. The only reason it worked this time was because he knew her only in passing, but it's certainly an unusual change. In Salt Lake City, a nurse is engaged to a doctor, but tragically passes away before their wedding. Later, a friend of the couple is at a dance. He spots the nurse in an evening dress, spinning on the dance floor. The thing is, he doesn't know she's dead. He thought he was just greeting an old friend and offers to take her home. Nothing odd took place, nothing strange was said. She just gets out of the car and walks to the house. This fella, being a doctor himself, naturally works at the same hospital as the couple. The story doesn't specify how, but he learns the next day of her death. Confused and distraught, he goes to her new grave, finding her evening dress draped on it. The ghost is almost always a young girl, picked up at a place of entertainment, rather than on a dark road. She never disappears, she's always dropped off at a cemetery or at home. Quite a few people have made the connection between this ghost and its vampire-like tendencies. I was a little confused by this at first, but I read on, and it started to come together. A young man is allured by this beautiful young girl who seems to float on air. In an almost Cinderella-like fashion, she frequently asks to be dropped off at her grave at the end of the night, before dawn. Even the frequent fate of the drivers is telling. Though she doesn't drain his blood, her simply touching him seems to have a life-draining quality, reducing him to a husk of his former self. Or dead, of course. And then remember the second to last story we heard, where the narrator realized he hadn't seen her reflection in a mirror? Well, Bram Stoker made this detail very popular in his book Dracula, which was wildly popular in the early 1900s, when this story was probably developed. This has caused some to theorize that perhaps this story started as something else, and then was written into becoming a Vanishing Hitchhiker story. Between the vampiric qualities, as well as being encountered at a dance, thereby negating the title Hitchhiker, I see what they mean. A few other elements of European folklore can be found in this version, most notably the belief that seeing a spirit would drive a person to madness. Alright, those 3 story types were the beefiest sections. We'll talk about a few more, but they'll be much shorter, as well as containing some intriguing details. What if you picked up someone who could warn you about an imminent disaster, or steer you away from tragedy? Maybe some people have. This story type follows most of the familiar beats, but this time, the ghost provides a prophecy or a warning. Some of the most popular renditions are those involving the Century of Progress Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, from 1933 to 1934. An automobile heading towards the Century of Progress Exposition is waved down by a woman struggling with a suitcase by the roadside. They cheerfully invite her to join them. While she does join them, her face is grim. She warns them all that the fair is going to slide into Lake Michigan in September. She then provides a Chicago address and invites them to come visit whenever they'd like. Incredibly stunned by this bizarrely specific prediction, they try to ask her about it, but she's gone. They decide to go to this address anyway. The man who greets them is the woman's husband, or rather her widower, as she's died 4 years ago. Another version sees a newly married couple returning from their honeymoon at the Chicago World's Fair, which is one hell of a honeymoon. Their last night of travel is very stormy, so they're driving slowly. They spot an old woman waving them down, so they pick her up. Telling them that she's from Ringsted, Iowa, she warns them not to go to the fair after September 1st. Why? Because the enchanted island is going to sink into the lake. What was the enchanted island? It was the portion of the fair that was specifically built as a kind of wonderland for children. I found a silent 16mm home movie that shows a shiny train with open-air cars crowded with little kids. An early go-kart track with a boy and his father zips around a course. A small Ferris wheel spins around and around, carrying delighted children. After the old woman's grim prediction, the wife turns to talk with her, but no dice. The couple decides to stop at Ringsted to investigate. The home that the old woman claimed to live at denies that an old woman matching her description lives there. But the old woman who lived there before them had died a year ago, to the day. When the couple describe the old woman's clothes, the current residents agree that the clothes sound almost identical to the clothes that she'd been buried in. A nearly identical story came from Rockford, Illinois. The main difference is that this time, the old woman claims that Northerly Island is going to sink into the lake on the 4th of July, Northerly Island being the main hub of all of the Chicago World's Fair activities. From what I could find, not a single prediction that a ghost gives, from this subcategory or the ones we'll talk about, is proven true. Fortunately, these predictions seem to have been a manifestation of nervousness in the wake of so many people flooding the city, probably paired with the eternal fear of children in peril. What else could be more horrible than to watch the portion of the fair crafted for children be drowned in the lake? The next doom that the ghost predicts is an epidemic. A story from the Midwest has a man driving along when he picks up a middle-aged woman as they approach an unnamed large city. She recommends a hotel to him before dropping the bomb that there's going to be an epidemic. She disappears, but leaves an unspecified item in the car. He goes to the address and questions the neighbors. They say her husband fell ill while she was away, but she'd tragically been killed when she was returning home to him. After that, quite a few people had shown up at the house with her items. As for the epidemic, she gives us no details, so there's no way to know exactly which epidemic she was referencing. The story of the hitchhiker, like any other story, has changed over the decades. Inevitably, religion would find its way in. In the 70s, Lydia Fish of the State University College of New York at Buffalo analyzed 60 texts that she and her students had collected. This time saying the hitchhiker was, quote, a beautiful young hippie clad in shining white, who talks about Jesus and the second coming before disappearing. A small note appears where sometimes the hitchhiker's seatbelt is still buckled, though they themselves have vanished. The source that described all of this did point out that none of those iterations were firsthand, which is hard to ignore. It wouldn't be difficult to rewrite a story to fit any kind of message or moral of religious persuasion. The stories with predictions of Jesus' second coming became known as, quote, Jesus on the Thruway. Here's one told in 1972 by a 19-year-old man from Buffalo, New York. John Hogan's fiancée and her aunt, with the extra detail that the aunt is a nun. Though, very strangely, this has no narrative purpose other than maybe irony. We're driving down the thruway when they stop to pick up a hitchhiker. The man asks if they've heard the gospel and if they know Jesus. His last words are, quote, "He's coming soon," as he disappears. They stop at the closest service area, reporting the incident to a gas station attendant. The attendant is completely unfazed. In fact, 20 other people have reported the exact same incident. Even the narrator's father, who works as a toll collector at the Williamsville Thruway, hears these reports all the time. Here's another. A deserted road during a cold and stormy night in 1978. A young woman picks up an absolutely soaked young man. This is already a little unsettling, but it's even worse when they both don't say a word for several minutes. I can only assume the driver was regretting her decision during that silence when the hitchhiker finally speaks. Jesus is coming again. And with his message delivered, he disappears. In Little Rock, reports come in about a mysterious hitchhiker who would ramble about the second coming of Jesus Christ. Not that out of the ordinary, until he vanishes from inside moving cars. The state police had 2 reports, both on a Sunday, both describing a cleanly dressed hitchhiker who disappeared. We have a quote from the driver of one of the incidents, as told by a coworker of the driving couple's daughter. Quote, "The girl said her parents and another couple were coming from Pine Bluff. They picked up this neatly dressed man because he looked like he needed transportation, you know? He discussed current events, he knew about the Iranian hostages, and all of a sudden he said, 'Jesus Christ is coming again,' and disappeared." The couple stopped a state trooper, sheepishly saying, "You're gonna think we're crazy." But the state trooper responded, "No, you're the 4th party that's told me about it today." These reports were published in the Salt Lake Tribune on the 26th of July, 1980. The last prophecy that was incredibly popular, for fairly obvious reasons, that the ghost predicts when the war will end, usually being World War II. This is almost certainly the desire of wishful thinking, that even the world of the supernatural yearns for the end of death and violence. The social structure of the United States had been shaken up so much, and the reports describing what was going on in Europe were so bad. I mean, who wouldn't be desperate for a glimpse of the war's conclusion? So, in Bluffton, Indiana, January 25th, 1942, Mr. and Mrs. Nutten are driving to Indianapolis when they pick up an old man walking along the road. "I have no money to pay for your kindness," he says as he steps out of the car, "but I can answer any question you may wish to ask." Mrs. Nutten asks, probably half-heartedly, when the war would end. That's easy. It will end in July. When the couple laugh good-naturedly, the hitchhiker repeats his prediction. Quote, "It would come true as surely as you will have a dead man in your car before you reach home." Okay. That got intense real fast. Well, as the couple nears Indianapolis, an ambulance skids and overturns in a ditch. The driver commandeers the Nuttons to take the patient to the hospital in Indianapolis. The patient is dead by the time they arrive. While dramatic and quite grim, the point of this seems to be one of proof. If a person or spirit is going to claim the end of a very serious, catastrophic event, how many people would believe it? You have to provide some proof that the spirit could predict the future. I don't know if that proof had to be a corpse in the kind stranger's car, but yeah. The last story type sometimes dips its toe back into the prophecy pool, but it mainly has to do with the hitchhiker being revealed as a deity. In the December of 1941, Mike, a cab driver, picks up an elderly Catholic nun in downtown Chicago. As they drive, the radio softly plays, and they talk about Pearl Harbor. She states, "It won't last more than 4 months." We don't know if he responds, but we can probably assume that he took this statement as wishful thinking. They reach their destination, and Mike steps out of the cab to open the door for her. He jumps in surprise when he sees her empty seat. Suspicious that the little old lady had bolted to skip her fare, he runs into the convent. Mike tracks down the Sister Superior, explaining the incident. Sister Superior asks what the old woman looks like, as she didn't know any sister that was scheduled to be downtown that day. Mike spots a picture hanging on the wall behind Sister Superior's desk. That's her! Looking up at the portrait, Sister Superior smiles. But she's been dead for 10 years. Now, the deity aspect kicks in via a San Francisco variant of this same story. Instead of a nun that had passed away, the cab driver identifies his passenger with a life-sized statue of Mary. An iteration from Kingston, New York, says the hitchhiker is Mother Cabrini, the first American citizen canonized as a Catholic saint. We also have a Mormon subcategory of the deities section. According to the Book of Mormon, the 3 Nephites were disciples of Christ, who walked the earth until his second coming. According to the Latter-day Saint scripture, quote, "can show themselves unto whatsoever man it seemeth them good." These retellings adjust the hitchhiker into the role of the Nephites, the first story appearing in 1938. A Mormon woman and her friend are driving into Ogden Canyon when she notices an older man hitchhiking. She doesn't usually pick up strangers, but he looks tired and has, quote, "a kind face." After driving and chatting for a while, he reveals he's from the distant future, when there'd be a great period of famine and pestilence. None would be spared from its touch. The driver asks if he's a member of the Mormon church, but he's gone. When asked to describe the man, the driver and her friend said he'd been short, with blue eyes, a gray mustache and beard, and that he wore an old black coat with tails, quote, "similar to those worn at the time of the organization of the church in the 1800s. A Professor Wilson compared 50 Nephite vanishing hitchhiker legends that he found in the Brigham Young University folklore archives. He suggests that some Mormons identified the Korean and Cold Wars with the disasters that the Book of Mormon prophesied. This would also explain the period of time during which the Mormon version of the vanishing hitchhiker was popular. However, Mormon church authorities downplayed the connection between God and these hitchhiker stories. Quote, "if he, as in capital H, he, had something important to say to the entire church, God would certainly not bypass his chosen leaders and attempt to spread the message abroad by sending Nephites hitchhiking through the countryside." This argument meaning, if he wanted us to know something, he'd just tell us. The last deity subcategory actually takes us all the way back to Hawaii. The first story was told by a Hawaiian native who was driving along a highway that twisted up the slopes of a volcano. He spots an old woman carrying a basket along the road, so he offers her a ride. She climbs into the back seat, but not for very long. When he reaches the summit, he turns to talk to her, but she's gone. This specific version, with the old woman carrying a basket, has been told and retold for decades. But what is it about this detail that's wedged itself into Hawaiian urban legends? The hitchhiker is believed to be the Hawaiian goddess Pele, goddess of fire and volcanoes. Like many indigenous cultures, Pele isn't a deity of good or evil. She's a goddess of balance. She creates new land, but she also destroys what was once in its place. Destruction and creation. She appears to humans to seek aid, punishing those who refuse. There's other iterations where Pele will appear to Hawaiians in disguise, warning them of upcoming volcanic eruptions. Let's look at what the woman carries: a basket. Weaving, particularly lauhala, has always been culturally significant in Hawaiian culture for thousands of years. Using native plants to weave baskets, hats, and floor mats had practical purposes. But weaving is also a cultural bonding activity. Groups would weave together, singing or playing Hawaiian music, and finding camaraderie improving their skills. There are weaving groups active today, which help Indigenous youths reconnect with their roots, and allows others to understand the passion and dedication that the craft demands. The old woman carrying a basket could be as simple as providing a scenario where a passing motorist would be prompted to stop, much like the college student carrying a stack of books or a suitcase. But I find the little details tend to matter. Another story from Hawaii comes from a reporter in 1936 on Honolulu. Out late on assignment, he takes a break at Waikiki Beach, looking to take a quick swim, but the beach isn't empty. He encounters a girl, eventually driving her home. She has him stop as they reach a house hidden in the trees, off of a road that leads to Nuuanu Valley. Thanking him, she gets out and shakes his hand. The narrator notices that her hand is still wet, despite them leaving the beach far behind them. He feels the seat she's been in, which is also wet with seawater, a piece of seaweed lying on it. The next day, he tells a friend about his evening. The friend is spooked, telling him that she'd been the daughter of a wealthy family who drowned on Waikiki Beach. Alright, we're in the home stretch. This last section is going to go over any variants that didn't fit well into the previous categories, but were too interesting not to mention. Let's go. The first takes place in Long Beach, California in 1933. There'd been a number of fatalities along Long Beach due to the earthquake on March 10th. The final numbers, according to the California Department of Conservation, sits at 120 deaths, with over 500 injuries. While the narrator drives back to Long Beach, she picks up an old woman, who's later revealed to have died a few days before the earthquake. I would have thought she would have died in the earthquake, and maybe there's a version or two of that, but I didn't see it. In Mexico, a traveling salesman is heading to Puebla with a friend when they see a girl walking along the highway. She confirms she's going to a town on his route, so she hops in. They arrive in the evening, so she invites them to stay for dinner. After meeting her sister, the night passes pleasantly with beer and dancing. But the salesmen have got to get back on the road, though they assure them that they'll stop by for another visit. The salesman gets his chance to go back about a month later, but the house is deserted, the yard overgrown, and the doors sealed with stickers. He tells a shopkeeper of his night with the girl and her sister. The shopkeeper says the girls don't live there, as one was killed on the highway between Mexico City and Puebla, naturally at the spot where they'd picked her up. And the sister moved away about 2 years before. The story implies that the sister must also have met an early end, since she was at this spectral dinner. The next story is unique for a few reasons. The first is that, although we don't get an exact year, the descriptors tell us that the story takes place before cars. The narrator isn't even riding a carriage. He's on a horse when he encounters a tall, slim girl in a poke bonnet. She stands beside the road in front of the burned husk of a house, its chimney the only thing left. Quote, "If you're going somewheres, I will give you a ride, because my horse carries double," he tells her. She accepts, jumping up behind him on the horse, light as a feather. She tells him her family name is Stapleton, and that her family is down the road a ways. They ride for a while, talking a bit. The story keeps the conversation vague, only revealing that her first name is Lucy, and that she's unmarried. As she clings to the writer, quote, "He could feel her breath on his neck while they was a-talking, and he liked it fine. He got to thinking that this was the kind of girl he wanted to marry up with, and he liked her better than any girl he ever seen before." In another mile, they come upon a graveyard. At the far side, they can see the lit windows of a big house. Lucy says, quote, "That's where my folk live, but I better get down here." She hops down and walks to the gate. The man calls after her, quote, "I'll be seeing you pretty soon." But she just waves and enters the graveyard. Now, I'm not feeling super great about this narrator. He's pretty creepy. How he describes her, immediately deciding she'd be the perfect girl to marry, telling her he's going to see her later, and so on. But this next part of the story pushes it over the edge for me. This man waits a while, so she'd have time to get home, and then he rides to the front of the house, climbs the stairs, and is invited by Mr. Stapleton to dinner, without telling him why he's there or what his intentions are. The Stapletons just believe he's a young man that got caught in the dark while traveling, and happened to come upon their house. The stranger sits at the table with Mr. and Mrs. Stapleton. As time passes, he gets irritated that no one joins them. Okay, the idea of an acquaintance dropping me off at the gas station closest to my home, and then seeing that acquaintance at the dinner table, what a romantic horror movie we have here. He's even invited to stay in the spare bedroom. And the entire dinner and night, he doesn't say anything about his encounter with their daughter. Over breakfast, the Judge Stapleton tells the mystery writer that he and his wife moved in a year ago. Quote, "We used to live 2 miles down the road, but our house was lightning struck and burnt plumb down. There ain't nothing left now but the old chimney." The writer nods, remembering the house. The judge goes on, "I didn't mind losing the house, only our daughter was sick in bed. We carried her out the gate, but the shock was too much for her, and she died that night." The writer is struck dumb, staring at the judge, who's now gushing about what a wonderful daughter she'd been. "We buried her in that little graveyard. You can see her stone from the front gallery. There ain't a day that goes by, rain or shine, that my wife won't walk over there and sit by the grave a while." After a minute of silence, the writer quietly asks, "What was your daughter's name?" "Her name was Lucy." Other than the stalker-coded writer, this is actually one of my favorite versions. It invites us in through the door, into the life of grief that the family members now live. It has us look at the now empty seat, an absence felt by everyone at the table. She's still very clearly in the hearts of the judge and his wife. Their love for her still overflows in how they gush about who she was and how they visit her. Although bittersweet, I love the slight depth it gives, as opposed to a quick, "she was dead the whole time" conclusion that we usually get. San Fernando, California, 1935. A young girl is picked up by an old man and his wife. They bundle her up in blankets and robes in the back seat, as she isn't dressed for the cold, wind, and rain. The traffic gets a little tricky, so conversation dies out for a while, and they assume she's gone to sleep. But we know. When they arrive at the San Fernando mission, the priests tell them that the girl was a foundling who'd lived at the mission her entire life. She'd been killed on Whittier Boulevard 2 years ago. The elderly couple is the third group that had stopped to pick her up. Heartbroken at the fate of the girl, the couple have no choice but to continue on to San Francisco. We explore a very dreamy, dramatic tale from Georgia back in 1912. A young man is traveling for business, looking to arrive at a specific inn by midnight. As he passes a grove of oaks, a girl dressed in a light dress from, quote, "a bygone period," suddenly stands next to the road. He stops to ask her if he can help her, though his horse jitters about, skittish and nervous. She speaks in a low, sweet voice. She'd been left in the grove, and she wanted to go home. He pulls her into the carriage, surprised at how light she is. He also notices a prominent dark stain on her frock, but he doesn't mention it for fear of seeming rude. A few miles down the road, her home turns out to be the ruins of an old southern mansion. The white pillars are still standing, but the floor of the veranda had fallen in. The man sits, frozen in shock, but the girl leaps from the horse. She crosses the lawn, gliding up the old stone steps and across the hole in the floor, floating right over the gaping pit. As she crosses into the moonlight, the young man finally sees that the dark stain on her frock is certainly blood. The man and his spooked horse don't need to see anything else. They race up the roadway to the inn, the young man bursting inside, demanding answers. The innkeeper tells him that this is a very common neighborhood ghost, a girl murdered by a jealous lover years before. She'd been killed at midnight in the very grove that the young man found her in. She'll request travelers to take her home to a family she'll never find. I've been surprised that we haven't come across Mary as a bride, which is always a common trope when it comes to tragic deaths and afterlives. But of course, I wouldn't be bringing this up if we didn't finally have one. A bride is preparing for her wedding at home in Fairborn, Ohio, while her mother, brother, and sister are decorating the church and greeting guests. The bride puts on her grandmother's wedding dress, finishes some last touches, and goes to meet her father, who's been patiently waiting to take her to the church. They hop into the buggy and set off down Trebain Road. The father urges the horse faster, the bride adjusting her veil. But the road isn't forgiving. The buggy hits a rock in the road. The to-be bride flies from the buggy, striking the ground and breaking her neck. The next day, the father and groom return to the scene of the accident. They're determined to dig the large rock out of the ground to prevent anyone else from suffering the loss that they had. They throw it to the side of the road, where it sits to this day. 2 days after the accident, they bury the young woman in her grandmother's wedding dress, in a cemetery less than a mile from her place of death. According to my research, this would be Byron Cemetery on Trebain Road. But it seems that she refuses to stay there. She can still be seen crossing Trebain Road, often around midnight in August. She appears in her wedding dress, sometimes as a misty ghost, but other times she looks like a living person. Whenever a driver picks her up, she urges them to hurry to the church to meet her groom. The story comes with the delightfully threatening line, quote, "Some say that if you encounter the bride and she touches you, you will become old and she will be young and alive again." And finally, our last story is a quick one. One night, a man meets a young woman in the neighborhood. The pair spontaneously decides to go to the local cemetery for a tryst. She borrows his jacket, but suddenly bolts. Following her, he eventually finds his jacket on a crypt. On that crypt is a picture of the girl entombed there. No prizes for guessing who the girl was. Okay, so that was a long drive in a very crowded car, what with all these hitchhikers. Next week, we break the story down, taking a look at the themes contained within it. This will give us a timeline for the building blocks so that we can analyze the spirits and folklore that led to this ghost. And finally, we really get our air miles as we hop from country to country, scrutinizing what the hitchhiker means to people all over the world. Same time, same place.